so we still have time for the discussion. Selamat datang juga untuk teman-teman yang bergabung, yang baru bergabung dari teman-teman dari Universitas Brawijaya dan juga dari diskusi publik ya, ini dari berbagai universitas maupun komunitas yang ikut dalam diskusi ini. Good evening from Indonesia and good afternoon to Prof. Olle. With us is also Dr. Wawan, who will give an opening remarks to today's discussion and the enthusiastic participant. My name is Faricha. I will be the moderator of today's discussion. I will use bahasa in English interchangeably for the participant. We will be conducting the discussion in English. If anyone has questions, you can write your question in the chat section. Pertanyaan bisa ditulis di kolom chat dalam bahasa Indonesia maupun bahasa Inggris. Dan juga bisa menggunakan fitur raise hand untuk menanyakan langsung ke Prof. Olle. We welcome our speaker today, Prof. Olle Tornquist. Prof. Olle is a Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Development Research in University of Oslo. Prof. Olle telah banyak menulis dan meriset tentang Indonesia, termasuk buku, jurnal, dan artikelnya, diantaranya Penghancuran PKI yang diterbitkan Komunitas Bambu, Aktor Demokrasi dengan Arif Budiman, Dilemmas of Populist Transactionalism with Lucky Jani, dan daftar karya serta sibling beliau dapat dilihat di website Prof. Olle. Nanti akan di-share oleh kawan-kawan Madat di kolom chat ya. Today we are also joined by Dr. Wawan Sobari. Dr. Wawan is a lecturer in Political Science Study Program at Brawijaya University. And among the participants of today's discussion, we are joined by political science students of Brawijaya University. Selamat bergabung teman-teman. And of course, warm welcome to everyone from various backgrounds to the discussion. Before we get into the discussion, we will be listening to an opening remarks by Dr. Wawan Sobari. Dr. Wawan, time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator. I would like to thanks for inviting me to deliver several talks. Not formal speech, but what I want to say is that it is honorable for us, especially for our discussion here, especially not only me, of course, not only my student from the Department of Political Science at Brawijaya University, but also for others participants or discussions. Prof. Olle is one of the outstanding Indonesianists, I think, with different perspective from others like Professor William Liddell and also like Benedict Anderson. Prof. Olle has a different point of view to see Indonesia, especially from his critical perspective. That my view to Pak Olle works, yeah, about Indonesia. And today, Pak Olle will share his observations about Indonesia, especially is there any social democracy in Indonesia? And this is very critical, and also maybe in the last 3 years, in the last 4 years, Indonesia, maybe we can say that I don't know whether it is the start of the implementation of social democracy or it is just a lip service of social democracy. Yeah, when Indonesia in the last 3 years, implement like a social protection, program, we can say there are BPJS, or jaminan sosial masyarakat, not only for health but also for workers. In the last 3 years, also Indonesia has like enacted a law, that relate to jaminan sosial nasional or social protection law. But we can also see that Indonesia is not only not in terms of law, but we have also Pancasila. We have social justice for all in the fifth principle. We have also humanity for all, in the second principle. That especially it reflects like what we say about social social democracy, yeah, and which in the last in contemporary social democracy, it is also connected to welfare state idea or welfare state policies, yeah, with the social insurance, with the social services like in European country. Of course, Pak Olle can also share about the experience, especially in Sweden or in Norway. Yeah, I was in 2005, 2006. I also lived in Europe, in Netherlands, and also, so I also can experience several government policies. Yeah, but of course, Indonesia is very different. Indonesia is different in terms of, because we can also see next, maybe Pak Olle can also say about what the link between the road of democratization in Indonesia, which in terms of the perspective, Indonesia seems to follow the procedural approach, not substantive approach like in Europe, where politics, social and economy, yeah, go hand in hand. Yeah, but in Indonesia, politics first, social and economic left behind. So this is what very different. So I think it is honorable for us, not only for the Department of Political Science of Brawijaya University, yeah, that we will join with Pak Olle, yeah, with his distinguished works, yeah, about Indonesia, and then Pak Olle. Department of Political Science of Brawijaya University is new department. Yeah, it was established in 2008. So now we are in 13 years of our since 2008. So we have three actually in our department. We have three major, yeah, about democracy and electoral politics, yeah, and then we have also Indonesian politics. And then the last is about political entrepreneurship and public policy. So we have three concentrations or three sub-department in our department. But still in Brawijaya University, it is just undergraduate. For undergraduate, we have no postgraduate program for political science, except in social science and in sociology. And then I would like also to thanks to the friend from Madat Club, from Madani Club, and for others, yeah, for our this great moment, yeah, to hear what Pak Olle say. Thank you, Pak Olle, and also for others. Yeah, I would Department of Political Science give high appreciation to Pak Olle and also to others, to my students, yeah, and then to others participants in these discussions, yeah, and then also to Madat Club as well as to Madani Club. That's all my opening speech, too much, but I think it is what I have also to say. Thank you very much, and good evening. Yeah, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Pak Wawan, for the interesting opening remarks. Well, it is also a good brief introduction to what we will discuss today. Is there social democracy in Indonesia? As Pak Wawan mentioned briefly, that interestingly enough, Pancasila values also perhaps in some way or another connected with the concept of welfare state that was implemented in Europe. But we see that democracy in Indonesia seems to be very much different from in what the European have, that it is still follow the procedural democracy compared to a substantive democracy. Where, as mentioned before, democracy is quite an interesting topic that will sprung many subtopics to discuss in today's social politics and still very much relevant. But we will specifically discuss social democracy. Is there social democracy in Indonesia? And without further ado, Prof. Olle, time is yours.
Thank you so much for your kind words and for inviting me to this important and exciting discussion. I'm very much looking forward to it. We have decided, the organizers and I have decided that we shall also use a PowerPoint. So let's hope that it works. So I would kindly ask the person who is managing the PowerPoint to share the screen now. Could you turn to the second, please? Yeah, very good. Are people able to see me as well, or am I hiding away now? Well, anyway.
Yeah. Yes, we can see you. Yeah.
All right. Then I cannot misbehave here. All right, that's fine. I shall draw on some of the findings in my retrospective book in comparative perspective, which will be out in October, so just 2 months ahead. And it is entitled In Search of New Social Democracy. Actually, the cover is, you see, is from Jakarta. I think it was in 1999. My argument today will be that broadly defined social democracy, I will return to how we define it, is not impossible. It's not impossible in Indonesia, but that it has lost out on 3 occasions. The first was the introduction of guided democracy. The second was during the struggle against Suharto and in the transition to democracy. And the third was the rise and decline of reformist populism associated with the Alliance for the Public Health Reform, which Wawan was mentioning, the public health reform and social contracts with leaders like Jokowi. Hence, the struggle for social democracy needs to be reinvented. And I think it has to be reinvented by recalling historical insights in addition to the current openings. So kindly, next slide, please. In order not to set any efforts aside by definition, so to say, social democracy may be best defined broadly as development based on social justice and now also environmental sustainability by democratic means. Such efforts have evolved during 3 generations. The first was, of course, the Northern industrialization, primarily in Europe and to some extent in the United States and Canada. The second, the Southern anti-colonial and anti-neocolonial struggle. And thereafter, there should be 3 there, the global liberal democratization from the late 70s until a few years ago. Moreover, one needs to read the social democratic efforts against some more specific historical characteristics. There are 4 cornerstones. The first is a broad interest-based collectivities. Traditionally, of course, the labor movement, but also urban poor and so on. Women's organization and more. The second is democratic links between state and society, and that the society should be of equal citizens. This is about democracy, but it's not just elections, right? And the third is social rights and welfare programs. This is where we talk about the welfare state and all these kinds of things. And the fourth is growth pacts between capital, labor, and primary producers, meaning agreements between employers and trade unions and associations often of farmers. If you're interested, we can discuss more about these elements later on. Second, one needs to also consider 5 major strategies to implement this. The first is to get into the state and dismantle capitalism from above. Second is to tame capitalism with rules and regulations. The third is to resist capitalism from outside the state. And the fourth is to escape it by various social actions, such as cooperatives and alternative lifestyles. And finally, the fifth is to combine the above by way of sequential transformative reforms, reforms that build stepwise on each other. Next, please. Could we turn to the next slide, please? Fine. So if we now judge against these criteria, if we judge Indonesia against these criteria, it's of course like most other countries in the global south, it has, of course, been up against serious problems of social democratic development because of the colonial history, because of the limited industrialization, and therefore also fragmentation of the laboring classes, as well as, of times, supportive middle classes. In spite of this, there have been impressive attempts, but as I already mentioned initially, they have lost out most. First time was in the introduction of guided democracy, I would argue. At the time, there was a reformist communist movement, and there were also associated left nationalists who had so far been very successful in mobilizing people and advancing in elections. Actually, at the time, they were probably the largest peaceful popular movement in the world at the time. But they gave up on liberal democracy in favor of Sukarno's and the army's populist guided democracy. I'm not going into details here, but I trust you know this history. Within that framework, moreover, they tried to advance in the framework of two primary campaigns for alternative development. And they did not generate the expected results. One of the campaigns, the major campaign, was on anti-imperialism against foreign powers, including against the Dutch, the United States, the British, and the so-called neo-colonial Malaysia, including with military means, nationalization of foreign companies. But whatever you think about this, it did not really weaken the domestic enemies of the left, including the army, corrupt bureaucrats, and their cronies. In many cases, they simply took over the nationalized companies and used them for their own purposes. Rather, unions, for instance, were held back. The other there were huge numbers of people out in the streets, but it didn't generate much change of power. The other campaign was for social rights and agricultural production by way of a land reform. But it was very difficult to unify the rural poor for this reform because the reform would only benefit a few. And others asked for more. So there were conflicts even among the peasants and the agricultural workers. And therefore, Sukarno had to call off the campaign in 1964. And the rural strongmen could continue to divide and rule, including by way of clientelism and communal loyalties. Communal loyalty primarily meaning religious loyalties. Meanwhile, to make things worse, liberals and middle-class based social democrats who were against this, they preferred instead the US-backed idea of politics of order, which was coined by the very famous American political scientist called Samuel Huntington. That meant that it was necessary to build an effective state and judiciary ahead of democracy. Hence, these people even came out in favor of General Suharto and the witch hunt of leftists. In the 17th then, some of the liberals and West-oriented social democrats who had supported Suharto changed their mind and turned critics, but they still said that democracy was premature. So student leaders like Hariman Siregar and dissenting officers first tried riots in favor of middle class rather than army-driven politics of order. They wanted the middle class to take over, so to say. And then insightful leaders like Arif Budiman turned 180 degrees, saying it was necessary to first of all fight for socialism, along with NGOs and the victims of the new order, because democracy didn't stand a chance against authoritarian international dependency. Next slide, please. The second time that efforts at social democracy lost out was in the struggle against Suharto in favor of democracy. Actually, the democracy movement was, formed, you could say, as a democracy movement from the late 1980s. Earlier, it was not so much focusing actually on democracy. But from the late 1980s, among others, the pioneering PRD activists focused less on civil society and more on what they call the masses, and on politics to democratize the state. Because according to these activists, the state was propelling authoritarian capitalism, so you had to take it over and make it more democratic. But then the admirable activists tried to serve as spearheads rather than to build the first pillar of social democracy, which we noted earlier, namely broad interest-based movements. And other pro-democrats didn't do much better. Actually, there was never anything like a united front with a viable alternative to the then liberal strategy of designing democracy with pacts among the powerful elites with some civil society organizations. Nor was there, in spite of the Asian economic crisis that hit Indonesian people worst of all, there was no ideas of an alternative policies against the neoliberal solutions. Hence, the scattered pro-democrats themselves lost out soon after Suharto had lost out. And being confined then, these pro-democrats, to civil society and unionism, those who tried to follow the recommendations from the participatory research that I was part of, to go politics, we said, did not reach much beyond lobbying, pressure politics, and transactions with politicians. They never managed to build a political bloc based on a broad common program and reform proposals. So in short, we can say then that the efforts at social democracy couldn't be built only from below. Slide 6, please. Next slide. The third unfortunate occasion when social democracy derailed was in the efforts of what I call reformist populism. If you want to discuss that concept, we'll do it later. This was the only successful attempt at the first pillar of social democracy and broad interest movements since the late 1950s. There were two fundaments. The first was the urban poor and citizen pacts with populist leaders like Jokowi for socially responsible urban development plans, such as in Solo and Jakarta. And secondly, the broad alliance between progressive politicians, unions, and civil society organizations, including among informal labor, for the public health reform, the BPJS. But then there was no follow-up of the welfare reforms to thus build a third social pillar of social democracy. There was no third social pillar in terms of welfare reforms. And there was no emphasis on deepening democracy beyond elections by way of some kind of democratic organizations and institutions for what we used to call partnership governments. That is more participatory management of the policies when they are to be implemented, to thus strengthen the second democratic pillar of social democracy. So from 2014, there was no broad democratic alliance to resist the rise of right-wing religious populism that expanded in the fight against Ahok in Jakarta. So by implication, Jokowi and his people compromised instead with the liberal freedoms and turned to horse trading with the political and military elite. We even got the infamous omnibus law of job creation, as it was called, and the crackdown on anti-corruption efforts. And in face of this, progressives, as I think, as I see it, has kind of turned prisoners of a triangular relation and quarrel between, on the one hand, liberals setting aside everything to defend freedoms and anti-corruption action. And another corner, social and union activists who bet on transactional politics to favor livelihood issues, and then floating Democrats trying to reform from within the palace and other similar places. Next slide, please. So it may seem as if social democracy really is impossible in Indonesia. However, if we go further back in history, we find that it was possible during the anti-colonial struggle and the first decade after, and during the first decade after independence, roughly until 1957-58. In contrast to those who organized on the basis of ethnic and religious communes, left nationalists during this period and reformist communists, they fought for equal citizenship and direct links between citizens and state, mediated by citizens-owned parties and organizations. That was not populism, right? Because it was not meant to be directly between people and a leader. It was mediated by citizens-owned parties and organizations. And this concept, this framework that they established, was then unifying enough so that it was possible to also add struggle for social rights, including from common language, health and education, and women's rights to land reforms. So this was how the progressives built the then world's largest peaceful popular movement and made huge advances in the 1955 national and 57 local elections. Unfortunately, this was then undermined by the decision in favor of guided democracy, with left populism and central army control. But in other contexts, quite similar to Indonesia, where the focus on civil and political rights and thus based social rights were sustained and expanded, such as in the southwest Indian state of Kerala, social democratic development did persist. Based on holding on to similar politics as the left-wing nationalists and reformist communists had given up in Indonesia in the late 50s, there were broad alliances in favor of equal civil and political rights, and with that as a foundation, additional struggle for social rights, to health, to education, and a decent land reform. It is true that even the Kerala priorities were not immune to clientelism, corruption, economic stagnation. But from the late 1980s, this was fought with democratic decentralization and participatory planning, initiated by progressive politicians and, even more important, civil society activists, with large movements. And this was not fully captured by the elite, as so much of other decentralization has been around the global south, because the land reform, there were no big landowners, and there was active citizenship. So right now, as we're talking, when having to fight environmental degradation and COVID-19, in addition to the right-wing, Hindu fundamentalist government in New Delhi, the left front in Kerala it's a left-center front, has been able to do what reformist populists behind Jokowi failed to do in Indonesia: to sustain and use democracy in order to mobilize local governments, civil society, to contain the pandemic, along with welfare and job programs and pioneering efforts at knowledge-based development. And this was also to help the huge numbers of returning migrant laborers. Thus, even many well-educated middle-class people in Kerala, who for years have benefited from the neoliberal development, they realize now that they too, not just the poor, needed public action for welfare and inclusive development. So the political result was massive victories in the 2020 local and 2021 state elections in Kerala. There are certainly challenges to move ahead, including not to to as the progressives in Indonesia when promoting reformist populism, that is to neglect democratic partnership governments. That's an issue in Kerala. But at this point, the right-wing Hindu nationalists dominating in India at large, they don't stand a chance in Kerala. In short, the results, I think you could change the slide now. Thank you. In short, the results from my concluding book on the efforts at social democracy in comparative perspective, it suggests that the attempts at need to be reinvented by first returning to the early successful work in which there was also a focus, on equal and inclusive citizenship and democracy. And that was combined with, it was a basis for and combined with social rights reform that support inclusive development. It can't be either or. You can't just have democracy and set the other aside. It has to be combined with social rights reforms. And it is the combination between, so it's the combination between equal citizenship and democracy on the one hand and social rights reform on the other that is so crucial. You know, as my friends in the Philippines used to say, you can't fight Duterte only by human rights, because most people are also very keen on their livelihood, right? The second thing is one needs to learn from the possibility, the positive thing of building the major pillar of broad interest movements, even in very socially and ethnically divided societies like Indonesia, by way of broad alliances behind welfare reforms, such as for public health. And thirdly, I think we need to learn from the need to generate follow-up reforms to thus build series of transformative processes. Can't just have wonderful, you know, after the welfare reform in Indonesia was decided on, people said, hallelujah, that's fine, now we can deal with other things. But it should have been followed up so that they continue to stand together. And when you can't do this kind of, you know, generate such reform proposals that unify, when that can't be done from the palace anymore, there were attempts, they didn't manage, some were hurting. It needs to be initiated, I think, by concerned intellectuals from outside, in collaboration, of course, with reflective activists in the movement. Finally, perhaps most importantly, we need to acknowledge the need to deepen democracy by not just improve elections and the financing of elections and so on. It's important, but it's simply not enough. We need to build frameworks for partnership governance so that all concerned can participate in policy development and implementation and negotiate comprehensive transformative reforms. Participatory budgeting has been there, for instance, in Brazilian Porto Alegre, but it could neither build new social democracy from below nor stop the decay and corruption in the capital. So, you know, reaction took over, even in Brazil. There must be links between the local activists and between them and the center. So I will stop here because I think the most important thing for us now is to have a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Olle, for the interesting explanation. I think it's a very critical introduction for our discussion. And okay, we already have someone who raised hand, Muhammad Faiz. Silahkan.
Okay. Am I audible? Can you hear me? Halo, suara saya kedengaran nggak?
Ya, terdengar.
Okay. I'm just gonna ask directly. Good evening. Before Professor Olle, can you hear me?
Okay. I hear you.
Right, okay.
If you speak very slowly, please.
Right,
Yes.
I'll speak slowly. No worries. I just want to ask about the feasibility of social democratic in Indonesia. Because in one of your books, Penghancuran PKI, you stated at least 3 figures in the form of Stalin, Musso, and Aidit, which correlatedly are the same in a sense that they are trying to use external force in trying to put communism in power. You also mentioned one of the strategy of social democracy will be trying to dismantle capitalism from above, assuming that people will vote in Marxist governments to rule, right? In your opinion, among both methods, which will be much more effective in trying to dismantle capitalism and achieve social democracy in Indonesia? Will it be through external force such as riots and a widespread revolution, or a much more political way in electing communist or social democratic politicians or government? Because in the latter, I think like Indonesian politicians don't really have an ideology, right? Because if you ask the difference of the differences of PDIP and PKS, they don't really have such differences. So which one would be the best method in trying to implement a social democracy in Indonesia? Thank you, sir, before.
Okay, thank you for your question. Important. First of all, I do think that these strategies that I listed, you know, they need to be combined. We shouldn't just say we need one. We do one sort of. So you need to have resistance from outside the state, for instance, combined with efforts at implementing reforms from within. But I think that, for instance, I think the most important thing is actually the 5th strategy that I mentioned, that one needs to come together around comprehensive reforms, like the welfare reform, the public health reform, because most of the other strategies that have developed have been linked to the existence of a very broad working class movement, and we can't assume that we have one in countries in the global south, because industrialization doesn't look like in the north. You know, there are so many informal laborers, what do you call them, freelance workers, and so on, and they can't be organized in the same way as trade unions traditionally. So therefore, it's so very important, I think, to come together around unifying reforms and to take it from there. I haven't seen, you know, but there are examples of this that have worked. I think it was remarkable the way it worked with the public health reform in Indonesia. I think it was remarkable to see many of the reforms in Kerala. There were reforms in South Africa initially, but definitely not now. And there were such reforms, for instance, in Brazil. So I think it's that is, as I see it, the main opening possibility. Yeah.
Oke, Muhammad Faiz, apakah ada tanggapan?
Yeah, maybe one more. Can I give like one more feedback, sir? So in the case of Indonesia, in the case we're looking specifically in the case of Indonesia, is it possible for, like, for example, let's just say that Indonesia gives birth to like a social democratic government, right? Will it be possible for them to garner support throughout channeling through the farmers or the unpaid or low labor workers of Indonesia? Because Indonesia has a lot of them, right? There's a lot of low class workers in Indonesia, and we have also a lot of petani, like in the form of farmers. Is it possible for them to garner the support in which it will transform into social democratic policies that will be implemented later on?
I think it is. I mean, you know, if we discuss, for instance, possibility, if there was a possibility in around 2013, 12-13, after the public health reform had been implemented, if there had been a continuation, a follow-up, discussing, for instance, how we could implement a right to work reform, which is not an unemployment necessarily insurance, but a right to work. In India, for instance, there is a rural employment scheme which gives the right to people to at least 100 days of work per year at minimum wage level. That was a good start in India. Unfortunately, it wasn't followed up because the right-wing government took over. But if there had been something like such a reform, or right to work reform in Indonesia, one example, then I think it could have advanced. And it's not a question of necessarily having a, very explicit social democratic government in place. That is something that might be developed over the years. But it's important to generate these kinds of reforms so that numbers of people can come together. And in the process, then discuss and develop democratic forms of implementing it. If these two things can be combined, I think it's not impossible. But it was never given priority to. and that I think I never really fully understood, because I was in Jakarta at the time, and we're quarreling with Said Iqbal and others about why couldn't the trade unions do this and that. We can go into details about that, but there were suggestions, there were serious discussions, but they didn't do it. They didn't go for it. Each movement, each activist group that had been fighting for the public health reform, left the common table, left their cooperation and returned to their core issues. The trade unions turned to their own wages, others turned to their specific issues.
Okay, bagaimana Muhammad Faiz?
Yeah, it's fair enough. Thank you very much, sir. It was very insightful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And next we have a question in the chat section from Nugroho Noto Susanto. He asked, you mentioned that Kerala is one of the cities that practice social democracy. Can you explain to us why Kerala can practice social democracy? Maybe Indonesia can make it happen. And he also asked, how important is the development of social democracy in one country?
Oh dear, a big question. Well, the first thing about Kerala, if I wanted to give you a short answer, I would say Kerala succeeded because they didn't do like the Indonesians did. They succeeded because they did not do like the Indonesian left nationalists and reformist communists, that is to support guided democracy. They didn't even support Indira Gandhi's state of emergency in 1975. They held on to the basic principles of liberal democracy, plus equal citizen rights and social rights reform. Basically, it's about that. And then, of course, that this was refreshed. This was further developed by something called the People's Science Movement, which in the late 1980s and 90s fought for decentralization and popular participation on the local level, which opened up for more people to engage, not just the party leaders and trade union leaders and so on. So that it's not more complicated than that, but it goes back in history, but that history was also there in Indonesia. If we reread the history of the nationalist movement, you'll find that it was to a large extent based on culture, education. You know, the nationalist movement in Indonesia didn't beat up the Dutch by armed forces. They made the country ungovernable for the Dutch. That's quite something different than to win in an armed struggle. They made it ungovernable. That's why the Dutch couldn't make it. So, you know, I think there is similar history in India and Indonesia. The main turning point was an unfortunate turning point, which hasn't been studied close enough by young activists in Indonesia, was this unfortunate turning to guided democracy. Because everybody said Sukarno was a great person. He was a great person, but that was a very unfortunate decision. You said also about social democracy and socialism in one country and all that. Of course, it's important. I deem it's impossible, and today this is a major problem in the north, in particular, in my own country, not least, where you know there is a kind of inward orientation, not least to exclude a lot of refugees and not take the discussion. They don't take the discussion with the right-wing populists, but rather make concessions to them. We can discuss that further if you like. There are similarities between that policy and the concessions given to the conservative politicians in Indonesia, including the conservative Muslims. And that is a kind of inward orientation that doesn't take this, that doesn't engage with the inevitable pros and cons of globalization. We have to do it. You know, it's crazy in Scandinavia that we are admitting that there is a threat against the climate, and then we just turn inward and not giving priority to what needs to be done in China or so many other places around the globe. Or for that matter, we don't engage very much in what's happening in the Middle East, with the conflicts in the Middle East, and now the catastrophe in Afghanistan. Even though we know that's from these cases, it's from these areas that all the refugees are coming. So how can we handle these things, these problems, without turning into nationalists? It's impossible. So it's narrow-minded politics not to do it. And unfortunately, people calling themselves social democrats are engaged in that, including in my country. So I definitely don't think you can have it in one country. It has to be increasingly international.
Thank you. It's quite a global view, isn't it, to make social democracy international? We move quite fast because there are several other who gonna ask question. Zarfan Gumanti, you raised hand.
Okay, thank you, moderator, for giving me time for giving my question. So my question is, observing what Faricha had asked before, it gave me another question to ask. We as a country is still having a trauma, but what leftist idea has left to us? We all knew about the 1965 story of how communists attacks the local Islamist figure. It gave us a big hole of trauma. Hearing about any kind of leftist ideology would give people a PTSD. Since 14 to 38 years under Suharto, we've been fed. We've been fed scary propaganda about leftists and another kind of stuff. And now during the reformist era, anti-communism is something the Islamic conservative always bring up. And they always frame it as people latent threat. And since our country is consists of 80% more of Muslims, it's kind of make a big deal for any kind of leftist ideology to adapt and to manifest its ideology in people. So my thought is, first thing first, maybe we need to build trust of the people about the ideology itself, especially the kind of we talk is democratic socialism. But the question is how, especially in a country where almost any kind of left ideology activity is being prejudiced, if not banned. So that is my question.
Yeah. You know, let me say three things. The first thing is I was trying to write, I did write a chapter in El Petiga's anniversary issue of Prisma about the 1965-66 genocide and what it, you know, the left's relation to it and how we should look at it and so on. So I hope that you can access it. I think the Prisma issue will be in Bahasa, so that can reach out. My second point would be that it's quite fine, it's necessary that progressives, liberals and social democrats and whoever that criticize, you know, the way in which the establishment in Indonesia engaged in the political violence in the mid-60s and all that. But it has to be combined with a critical discussion of the leftist politics at that time as well. This is not to say that all these people who suffered from the killings must sort of blame themselves in any way. It's not that, but we need to understand also from the leftist position, from a social democratic position, what went wrong during the heads of it. And that takes us back again to guided democracy. And if we go into a discussion, a critical discussion of that period, we can also use that as a critique against the current illiberal policies that are employed by the government, because there are similarities. And so I think we you know, criticize, yes, what happened during that period so that we get it right. That has to be done. It is the same thing as progressives, Democrats in Germany had, of course, criticized the Holocaust, the Nazis and fascists and all that. It has to be done. It has to go deep and so on and so on, but it must also be combined with a critical analysis of what the left did at the time. So it's not black and white, and that is necessary to understand how we move ahead. And thirdly, I think this historical research is crucial, because what Indonesia lacks most of all is critical history. I think that is, you know, absolutely crucial. During the periods that I worked intensively in Indonesia, I was so surprised repeatedly on how little of critical historical analysis and teaching and studies was there. So I think that is very, very important. And finally, I think that once you have that critical historical perspective, we shouldn't get locked up in one ideology and the other, and you know, the specificities of this and that strategy and so on. Again, I think what we need to focus on are some major reforms, combining citizen rights and social welfare. That's the only way we can reach out to people beyond the civil society organizations and our own fine seminar rooms. I can't say more than that, and I shouldn't say more than that.
Ya, Zarfan, apakah ada tanggapan?
Cukup. Thank you, Mr. Olle, for the answer. Very insightful.
And we also have, two questions in the chat section. First from Linda. Hi, Prof. Olle, what is your view regarding the current condition of Indonesia where identity politics is getting more massive? Will it really affect the progress of social democracy in Indonesia? That's a good question.
Hi, Linda. Is this Linda from Ambon, is it?
Yeah, is the name? Yeah, is Linda Ambon.
Okay.
Yes, Olle, how are you?
I'm fine, Linda. There, I see you. Good to see you.
See you.
I think maybe I'm too optimistic, but what I think is the best way of addressing the issue of identity politics is, yeah, simply speaking, viable universal state welfare reforms. And that brings me back to Kerala again. I mean, it's only when there are viable public welfare reforms that people do not need to turn to their religious congregation or to their adalah communities or to the mosque for help. They should, of course, be able to go to the mosque to pray and meet and socialize. They should be able to go to their adalah communities to do local joint work and defend their fishing rights, etc., etc. But that should not be, everything in life, because if you have to do that, then identity politics is not just about religion or religious communities or adalah communities or anything like that. It's about your livelihood. And so, the livelihood issue has to be sort of conquered by progressives who say it's better to have public welfare reforms. It's better to have compulsory public schools than Quran schools. Just to mention one of the reasons for this deterioration of Scandinavian, and particularly Swedish social democracy, is that we have had a neoliberalization of the school system. So we have more and more private schools. That is undermining our entire welfare project. So I think that is the common and most important way of addressing things. And if that can be, argued for, motivated, etc., including by people who are in the Muslim community and so on, not just by radical socialists and blah, 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 but also people who realize we have to have this as a common project, then it makes sense. Let me take one of the most touching, I think, experiences from, again, Kerala. When did that priority start in Kerala? Actually, it started in the turn of this century, between the 19th and 20th century. It was during colonialism. And at that point of time, Kerala was the most stiff caste system with enormous inequalities, including the fact that some people were untouchable and couldn't go to the same place to pick up the water, and they couldn't go to the pray together with others, and so on and so forth. And what happened during that period of time was that number of socio-religious reform movements emerged. They began by saying, hey, we should also have the right to go and pray in the same place, or we should have the right to some kind of health to the same extent as others, and so on. So there were specific demands. But after some time, in the beginning of the 20th century, they realized on their own, if you like, that they had to come together to make a difference. So they began to say, not just better rights for the Adivasis, the tribal groups, or for the lowest caste, or the people who didn't even belong to a caste, but common demands, equal demands for a number of issues. Equal demand, equal rights to some basic health, equal demands, equal rights to public schooling, and so on and so forth. And they began to rise this. And then that brought them together. And the second step was then when they realized that they had to be even broader and link up with more socialist-oriented people in demanding some kind of land reform. That's what made the difference. So this is my lesson, and I still believe in it. And I do think that this was also very, very crucial, in the northern states. It was not just trade unionism. It was this kind of citizenship combined with livelihood issues. And of course, you had it during the good years in South Africa when the ANC and Mandela and so on brought up the civic issues. They didn't just say Black people unite, they said equal rights. And that combined it. Now it has crumbled, and we can turn to why, but I think that was crucial.
Okay, bagaimana Bu
Olle,
Linda?
thank you Olle for explain.
Okay, we have quite several people who ask questions. Now I will read the question from Muhammad Isom. He asked, social reform in many cases usually led because of the government failed to handle the economical matters. As you have mentioned earlier, social reform could be done through two ways, through the mass protest and through the upper hierarchy. During the pandemic, although our governments remain exclusive and even more oppressive, our economy remains stable, as the news says that we are successfully out of recession. What are your thoughts on this? Are we able to develop social reform with our current condition? Okay, social reform within this pandemic, it seems.
I have to admit that partly because of the pandemic, I have been sort of in quarantine here in my little coastal village for now, what is it? Close to 2 years or something. I haven't been able to travel to do field studies, to follow the developments in any other way, but by reading papers and talking to people via internet and so on. So I should not be cocksure about what has happened in Indonesia and what could be done with regard to the COVID-19. It's really a tough issue. I mean, I got involved, in Kerala. I got involved in I wasn't in Kerala, I was an outside, but I got involved in the struggle for doing things there, and they did remarkably well because they had this democratic decentralization and a lot of civil society participation and so on the local level. Initially, they did a remarkable job, and there were hardly any cases of COVID-19, and they even also managed in the beginning to take care of a lot of migrant laborers who came in. There is something like 33 million people in Kerala, and 1.5 million people returned from the Gulf countries. In Sweden, the people complain about 150,000 refugees coming in during the war in Syria. Kerala managed 1.5 million people. Anyway, so they did remarkably well, but they couldn't really handle when COVID-19 sort of expanded in wider scale, where you couldn't contain it just locally, and so the contamination sort of spread in the wider community. Then they were not as capable. They were still capable of doing welfare work. Nobody was set aside and so on, and that was remarkable, and that was why they managed to win elections later on. And people just, even middle-class people said they did remarkable. But there were also drawbacks in the capacity of launching vaccination campaigns and tracing and so on a larger scale. Now, from what I hear in Indonesia, there has been a sort of vacillation between closing down and keeping up services. That is also something which has been done in my own country. We have not had any lockdown in Sweden, as compared to Norway, for instance, which keeps locking down all the time, more or less. We have not done that. But then it was so crucial that we had a massive campaign for how people themselves should be able to keep, distance, handle precautions against the disease. And then, of course, that is easy to do in Sweden, where so many people can work from home and are not living in crowded urban poor areas and so on and so forth. So if you shall be able to do something similar like that, in a case like Indonesia, you need to have much, much more of welfare programs to help people to cope with it and work voluntarily with the anti-COVID measures that need to be taken. And I haven't seen that happen. So that is, and that I think is exactly, in a way, an opening for something that could be, beginning of a welfare program. But I don't know the details of that, how it should be done, and so on.
All right. And next question we have from Madat Club. Madat Club, you raised your hand.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, Prof. Olle. It's me, Reza.
Good evening.
Thank you very much. So, I just want to ask a simple question. Seeing from what was happening in Indonesia lately, especially the trauma from 1965, and is it possible for a new leftist party to be, what did you call it, rise or implemented or made in Indonesia? Like the PKI or PSI, a new kind of leftist party, because the last one I see PRD was quite, for me, it's a failure, What do you think? Just that.
Yep. I don't think that, I know some people will be critical of me now, but I don't think that the main priority is party building. At least not party building in order to participate in elections, because the electoral system must somehow be reformed before it makes, main change. I mean, I don't think it's wrong by the Solidarity Party and so on to try to make their way. It's nothing wrong, but I think the main priority has to be to build up broad interest-based movements, and to try to find these to develop these and demand these supplementary forms of participation in public governance. So because if that is, if we get stronger popular organizations and interest organizations into the management of state, into the running of the state, into the running of even down to the village level, it makes sense for people to engage in these kinds of organizations, right? And then those, if we then add, as I've said so many times now, if we then add unifying rights for citizenship and democracy and social rights together, then we have a movement. And we can't build parties without movements. So I think it's, I'm not saying you can do all these things from below. I don't think we managed to do that. I don't think we can see that because it's so scattered movements and all that. We need to develop these reform frameworks to unite around. Now, take for example, I mean, if you look at the Brazilian case, where Lula da Silva and all that, you know, I mean, they managed to come together in the context of local direct elections, as we call it in Indonesia, meaning, you know, elections of governors and mayors and so on. I mean, I know that direct elections are terribly costly and invite all kinds of money politics and so on and so forth. But in the current context, I anyway think that these kinds of elections are opening up for broader unity, because you have to come together to make it feasible. You can't just go for this little party, that little party, and then trust in the party leaders to negotiate once they are in parliament. So these parties will then, you know, develop all kinds of patronage politics and so on and so forth. So I think unfortunately, but anyway, there is an opening around these kind of direct elections. But then, of course, as I said so many times, what failed in Indonesia, what failed in Brazil, was that there wasn't a kind of democratic form of negotiations between the popular movements that engaged in this and the political leaders and the governance of the cities and the country at large. And also the local organizations didn't engage in that. They didn't engage in these problems of what I call sort of partnership governance. And I think there is a special case for this in Indonesia as well, because there is such, if we go back to 65 and all that, and if we go back to guided democracy as well, nobody wants to return to corporatism. Nobody wants to return to sort of, you know, the Golkarist kind of state corporatism, right? We have so many bad experiences from that, not least in Indonesia. But and that has kind of given free space, free way for liberal pluralism instead. But there must be something in the middle here. And that's where I think social democracy have ideas. If we go back to Scandinavia in particular, social democrats subscribe to liberal democracy, but also to this form of partnership governance by way of public commissions, where various groups, where all people were concerned were represented, by wage negotiations, where people were represented in various hearing sessions on proposals and so on and so forth. All the way, all in the state, in the public administration, you had these kinds of participatory practices, and they were not just localized; they were also national forms for national participation in this. So, yeah, that I think is a possible opening.
Yeah, Reza, do you have any comment on that?
Oh, the explanation is very enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you, and perhaps some of it is quite intriguing, but also interesting. And next we have question from Pak Joash. Good afternoon, Olle. It's me, Joash. I would like to pursue further Linda's question, do you still believe that merely universal social welfare is enough to stem the wave of the right? In quotation, I don't want to call it populist politics.
If universal welfare is enough to what?
To stem the wave of the right politics. Well, he said he don't want to call it populist politics.
Okay,
Okay. Yeah. Such wave also hits countries and regions that have been known for their exemplary universal social welfare regime. Norway, Sweden, even Kerala seems not to be immune to this tendency. That's his question.
Well, it's of course, I mean, my general argument is that universal welfare is the way ahead to try to defend it and further develop it. But I have to, we have to be aware of the fact that even in Kerala, we've had problems of universal welfare policies because there have been a long history of special groups pushing their issues. Right? So, and it's very difficult to combine things here. Let me just give you an example so you understand what I'm talking about. For instance, if you organize, it's one thing to get trade unions in the best world, sort of in the best case, you can get trade unions to agree on some common policies, some common demands on welfare, some common demands on labor rights, in addition to their special rights. But it's very difficult to organize in the same way informal labor to unite and have a presence. Because they don't have the same workplace, it's difficult to get together, it's difficult to organize simply. Now, Kerala managed here. It's incredible. They call many of the manual informal labor to headload workers. I mean, meaning, you know, you need all kinds of practical work. Day laborers in the street, in the railway station, in the mines, and so on and so forth. Now, they organized on the basis of their profession. There were closed shops, right? They controlled the labor market for these informal laborers. That's dangerous, but that was the only way of doing it. Now, and they managed, and they got special benefits, and they negotiated wages and so on and so forth within their profession. But that was also problematic later on when you want universal welfare policies, when you don't want to have, you know, this group, this group, this group, that group, right? That profession, this profession, etc. So it's really not easy. So what I think here has been so important, if we go back again to Indonesia and the public health reform, there were successful attempts there to find a way of, you know, develop a program for both informal labor and organized labor, both for people who are sort of freelance workers and others. And it wasn't ideal, but there was an opening for it. And if you can develop that combination, that I think is so very, very, very crucial. And the same goes for employment reforms or job reforms. We'll have to sit down sort of and develop this. And this is something that concerned intellectuals should engage in, right? Doing comparative studies about experiences from various places in doing this. Also why this has deteriorated. We need to learn from why it has partly deteriorated in countries like Sweden. A final point in this is the following. We can't win this battle for broad, if I say we now in favor of some broadly defined social democratic reform. We can't win only by the poor people supporting it. But that has to be broader. It has to include, you know, numbers of middle classes, including intellectuals. In terms of numbers, we will never, you know, win votes if we are not more people than that. Not even in Sweden, in the midst of industrialization, could social democracy win elections and dominate the society. Only with trade unions, only with the laborers. They had to have alliances. So they did engage in alliances, first with farmers and then with you know, middle classes. And therefore we need to discuss that. And how we do that. And the other aspect of just winning middle classes is, you know, middle classes have to be enrolled in paying for it. This has to be paid for by taxes. So the trick has to be to convince middle classes that they do better by paying taxes for a public health system than having to do it privately. That, I think, is the most important, one of the most crucial issues. And if we can't convince people, middle classes, about that, they will solve it privately. They will take private insurances. So, and that is the risk now in Scandinavia, that you know, people who do well say, okay, state system, public system is deteriorating. I have to take a private insurance myself. And if you take a private insurance, you don't want to pay taxes for the others. So then it deteriorates. So that is the crucial competition. And they have to be engaged and involved in that. If you don't have the middle class, if you only have targeted welfare for the poor, so to say, there won't be much money. There won't be much money to give to the poor. We have to have it broader. We have to have it for more people, and we have to have the tax money from the middle classes, and we have to convince modern employers that they too need to have a public health system that works. Otherwise, they can't run their factories, including during COVID-19. and they too need to have education system. Otherwise, they can't have skilled laborers and skilled administrators. And it's better to have it publicly than to have it privately. So these are the battle lines that we have to develop.
All right, interesting. I think in Indonesia, we also have BPJS for workers, and it was kind of enforced. I know this because I see it firsthand with my friend who has a small firm. He's starting out a small firm, and because he hasn't register the worker, it's just a small firm. It's just 2 or 3 people inside, but the government, the state already sent a form to register the workers, and even if he hasn't, there will be fine for that. Yeah, I think that's one way to collect the taxes.
Yep.
And Pak Joash respond, cheers, Olle. I love when you mention the dangerous parts and curious to grapple with them further. Next, we have a question from Eliza Jennifer. I have this question, where in Indonesia, the country itself tried to live in and create life in the 4th Industrial Revolution. The question is, is social democracy eligible to live up the 4th Industrial Revolution, or they cannot be combined? Thank you. That's the question.
Let me begin by, no, how shall I do this? Well, there is a kind of short-term reaction from social democrats in my own country to the 4th Industrial Revolution, which is we can only handle this by emphasizing what you call it, education-based development, knowledge-based development. That's the slogan, right? Knowledge-based development. So we have to defend our high standards and our jobs by being the best in the world to have skilled education. And then the slogan is we have to climb the value-added ladder. Have you ever heard that term? I mean, more advanced industries. So we climb it and we make, and that means that somebody else around the world will have to make a simple, will do the simple production for us, somewhere far away in China or somewhere. So that is of course, on the one hand, it's what we need to do. We need to have a kind of knowledge-based development, but it can't be social democracy in one country, as we talked about earlier. Because if we do that, we create conflicts around the world. We dehumanize ourselves by saying that it's only for us. And there will be conflicts, environmental catastrophes and whatnot around the globe if we just do it in one country. And then you can say, we will have the same problems if we just do it for some people in our own countries. If it's only some people who sort of get this high skill training, and the rest, what shall they do? Well, they can clean the floors and take care of our kids and care for the elderly or something. So if we don't want a society where inequalities are expanding and where those who are not getting good jobs will have to clean the streets or do the lousy work, then we'll have to have a social democratic government, or a social democratic administration which is negotiating this and is providing job guarantees, providing basic security networks for people, and help people to educate themselves. One example which is stimulating, I think, is that when Kerala has, as I told you, been unique in India for having had very good education for a lot of people. But when neoliberalism expanded, those who had managed to get themselves very good education were suddenly able to sell their labor internationally. So they benefited from a social democratic oriented education policy by getting their private benefits as skilled laborers. And then they could, turn migrant laborers and go not least to the Gulf states and build the bloody airports for the Arabs. They are the Kerala people running the airports and building the airports. Now what Kerala center-left government is saying now is, we don't want to continue this. We'll have to work from Kerala so that people can sell consultancies. They can come here as medical tourists and do their expensive health work or whatever, but they shouldn't go elsewhere to do all these kinds of things. And particularly not to the Gulf area, because if we go there and help them build their societies, we're also sustaining the dependency on oil. And Kerala itself will be dependent on the oil economies, which are polluting the world. So we don't want that. We want to build alternatives to the kind of industrialization that is going on in the Gulf area. So these are international issues at the same time. And so my simple answer to it is, classical social democracy are not very good at handling environmental issues. Definitely not. and particularly not those who are very deep down into the factory-based trade unionism, because they will continue to be afraid of their work, and they will continue to say, we need to produce cars, and if you stop doing the this and that mining and this and that for deforestation, etc., then we will lose our jobs. So that social democracy is not very productive here, and it's not very helpful. It has to be combined with broader agreements, but then these broader agreements, who can make them if we don't employ regulations, if we don't provide broader agreements and mobilize some basic, on the basis of equal citizenship. And I think that's what broadly defines social democracy is about. So there is a potential, but if it's back into the very conservative social democracy, then it's lost. Then it's lost.
Okay, thank you for the explanation. And we have another someone who want to ask, Randall Mark. You may ask.
Okay, thank you. So I want to start with, all we know here that we live in globalization flow, right? Which means that we are live in the capitalism era. All we know capitalized by the globalization. So, and I think it's not merely about politics matter, but also the economical matter. And if I summarize your previous explanations regarding this topic, you kind of emphasize an economic politics reform. So, so I want to inquire this, and also I want to hear your opinion or your idea about this. So, can the term of social democracy be simplified as reforming and humanizing capitalism as one of ways to achieve welfare state in Indonesia?
The Nobel laureate, what is his name, Joseph Stiglitz, phrases it as the new deal in the United States that progressive Democrats are involved in. They talk about a kind of, I can't remember the word now, but a kind of a human capitalism, kind of, that they want to keep the market, they want to keep the propelling incentives in market-driven development, but they want to regulate it in a social democratic way. If you recall the 5 major strategies that I mentioned, it's primarily the second strategy, that is to tame capitalism with rules and regulations, and then of course with welfare policies that are necessary. I think there is much to it, but there are 2 points to be raised here. The first is the fifth strategy, to transformative reforms, because if you only tame a wolf, he will continue to be a wolf. You have to somehow change the wolf into a dog. You get the point? You can't just try to domesticate the wolf. You'll have to transform the wolf into a dog, which is, it's easier to work with and to change the society. And it's that transformation that needs to be added to all these taming and regulations and so on. So if you want now to build an alternative economic proposal to the omnibus law in Indonesia, to really make things difficult, right? Assume that Indonesian progressives were sitting down and saying, we can't just oppose the omnibus law, we need to have an alternative way of generating jobs. which is better for nature, better for people themselves, and better for the elderly, and better for women, and so on and so forth. How do we do that? We have to ask that question, otherwise we can't. So then I think it's not just one reform; it's a series of reforms that we need to develop, and it has to be combination of these reforms, so that is I think that is the necessary approach to it. I'm not against this American idea about a new Green Deal programs, etc. It just needs to also be combined with a number of other reforms that strengthen people's capacity to continue the struggle. That's the trick. So let me see, what can I take as an example? We shall, of course, support what do you call them? The informal workers who work as domestic workers, the domestic workers, right? There's huge numbers of domestic workers in Indonesia, but it should be combined with more firm regulations on working hours, and it should be combined with the possibility to develop kindergartens so that increasing numbers of domestic workers can get regular work in kindergartens rather than babysitting for the rich. You see that the difference, not just defending the domestic workers and making them survive, but developing policies that also transform, to help them and also transform the situation. That's what I mean.
Randall, Mark, do you have a response?
So can we call it as a humanizing capitalism or not?
Well, I wouldn't use that term because we need to change capitalism. It needs to transform capitalism. We need to transform it into a more human form of economic development. So I wouldn't say that. I would say, let's try to get to talk about the specific effects, what we need, what we aim at. I mean, I remember, take an example. There was a debate in the 1950s or something between the Swedish Social Democratic leader at the time and Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time. And Khrushchev was very self-astute at the time. It was before the downturn of Soviet Union and so on and so forth. So he was very self-astute and said, we are doing very well, and you people are just defending capitalism and so on and so forth. And then Erlander said, but because the name of the Swedish Social Democratic leader was Erlander at the time, he said, okay, let's stop talking about socialism and capitalism for a while. Can we talk about what is the level of inequalities in Soviet Union? What is the level of social standards? What is the level of welfare? What is the standard for the women? What is the standard for the kids? We need to boil it down into these categories and talk about the best possible way of reaching there, rather than, being confined to sort of very, very stiff categories like capitalism or socialism. It's about finding ways together, and I'm quite convinced that collective solutions, public action is the best way of doing it. But let's talk about it in terms of efficiency, effectiveness to reach these aims. That I think is the best way of handling it, rather than saying human capitalism, because that's only defending the poor people. We want to change it. We want to make it into something better. Call it socialism or call it something else, but we need these effects, these better ways of doing it. But I think, and we can't avoid one thing, which I think is, has been made very clear with the recent years' debates. We have to address the issue of inequality. I mean, we can't build a better societies when inequalities are increasing globally in such an absolutely ridiculous way and so I don't know what to call it. These things. So there has to be an attack against inequalizing sort of capitalism where the inequalities are just increasing. That I think we have to speak up against. That is unavoidable.
Okay, I get your point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a lively discussion. I'm surprised myself. But here we also see a new perspective, but not only about the social democracy itself, but also the policy for us, more social democracy. We still able to have one question if anyone has any question. But before that, maybe I've been really want to ask this. You mentioned about CSO-based democracy. Was it also part of the necessary condition for social democracy to thrive? Because what we experienced in Indonesia recently, that civil society organization, some of them who is opposing government is blatantly repressed. What's the importance of having a thriving civil society organization in for social democracy?
If we very broadly defined, if we say that civil society organizations are primarily organizations among citizens, okay? So that presupposes that we have people with citizen rights who on the basis of citizen rights can make their own lives better and help others and suggest things. This is the basis for civil society, that you have citizen rights. That is nothing which social democracy has been against in any way. They would rather support that we get more people with decent citizen rights to be able to work on the basis of citizen rights to improve society, to put forward and so on and so forth. But the problem is that if we turn to a country like Indonesia or India, so many people do not actually have citizen rights. It's just on paper. They can't really use their citizen rights. There are limitations to it. So it's basically primarily, people who know how to use these rights and have enough money, enough funds, enough education, etc., who can build civil society in terms of people who base themselves on actual capacity to use their citizen rights. Right. So we also need to talk about popular organizations, popular movements, who base themselves more on numbers, more on being many, more on being capable of blocking production, more of being able to block a road to an area if they don't get their basic interests satisfied, etc. So we need to do both here. And that's why it's probably essential not just to put an emphasis on the existing civil society. We need to combine, let's say, take the domestic workers again. Yes, most of them are, this is popular organization primarily, aside from those who are helping to lead them. Now, they base themselves on numbers primarily, and then there are a few helping them. So they base themselves on numbers. But we need to combine support for their livelihood, their social economic issues, with better citizen rights. That's how I see it. And it's good, of course, that a number of wonderful activists are combining their activism with these women, but that needs to be combined. So, you know, and that means that civil society organizations need to be able to link up with the broad popular organizations and find ways of doing that. To tell you a story from the time when I was working with this research organization, Demos, when we did the democratization studies in the 2000s. So we said, okay, it's fine, we do this, but we should also perhaps, you know, engage in a kind of popular education movement, which is working with democracy issues. But then there were so many people working inside this civil society organization, the civil society research organization, which said, no, we can't build a broad popular educational movement, even though we have thousands of people who have engaged in these studies, because there is a risk that they will take over, that it will be infiltrated by all kinds of stupid people and whatnot. So that it didn't happen. So we had a narrow little intellectual civil society organization and nothing on the other side. But I told you earlier about a popular education movement in Indonesia, in Kerala, which revitalized the development policies in there and fostered the local development and participatory democracy. That was a popular education movement, precisely with a lot of teachers and intellectuals, but also ordinary people who engaged in that. But we didn't do that in Indonesia. We could have done that. We didn't do it. It was a shame.
Thank you for the enlightening explanation. We can still have one question. If anyone has a question, you can raise your hand or type in the chat section. Talking about education, it actually suddenly comes to me about the policy that was implemented during Suharto era. Now it came to me, was it actually it's an era where there's a good chance for social democracy to thrive. What do you think about it, sir?
No, I didn't follow. Can you take it again? Sorry, I must have missed something.
So about the education system, it comes to me that it's actually a kind of education and also health system also was pushed in the Suharto era, and many people able to get a better education and a better healthcare system. Does it then makes the Suharto era an era where it's actually social democracy have a chance to thrive?
No, I mean, for a social democratic oriented education policy, I think by definition has to combine two things. The one is that it is for all, that it's inclusive in the sense of, you know, economic, that you don't have to pay high tuition fees and all of that. You don't have to pay for going to school, and you should be supported in various ways for this, including, of course, that those poor people who need the labor of their kids to survive their business and so on and so forth have to be compensated in order to allow their kids to go to school and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. It means that democratizing the education system in that way, and also allowing people to take part in running the education and so on. Not, of course, that they shall take over the job of the teachers, but they should be engaged in discussions and so on and so forth. But then there is the other thing, and that is, what do you focus on in the education? And what is the curriculum, sort of? And this is possibly, if you have a public school system, defend that. That is possibly the best way of building a democratic society. If we all go to the same school, sort of, if we all engage in a plural democratic discussion. This is breaking down now in Scandinavia. It's so terrible, while they try to build it up again in the United States, and we have to redo this kind of things in Scandinavia. But I think this is absolutely crucial, and it was not just sort of socialists doing that from the beginning. If we go back to the 19th century, this was also a liberal project. And those who were very, very engaged in it over the years were women. So, because it combined, if you look at the grades, if you look at the results in the school system today, who are doing best? The women, the girls. They have gotten a chance to advance by not fighting in the schoolyards, but by doing good reading and by merit. So that is something which links up with the women's rights issue. Merits, ability to do that without using your elbows or your family relations or your, the tradition in society that men should be first and all that. So I think this is so crucial. And go back again. What was the basic for the Indonesian nationalist movement? It was education. Revive that.
Yeah.
Revive that.
Hmm. It's interesting that this was part of the monthly discussion by Madat, and this month a bigger topic was about national revolution, and it seems that our discussion today is what comes after national revolution, the policy for to provide a wider healthcare system and a more accessible education, inclusive education for all. And I think I've been noting that you mentioned a lot about how the government should follow up the policy that they made, correct? And also about the importance of working together as alliance, and not only from below. It has been a very lively discussion and intriguing as well.
Okay.
I think since there's no more question, and that we also almost run out of time, that concludes our discussion. Prof. Olle, it's very enlightening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very good to talk to all of you, and I hope that this dreadful pandemics will round up at some point of time so that we can meet again.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
And that it's wonderful that this virtual meeting actually happened because of pandemic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day, sir.
Same to you. Okay.
Thank you,
I turn
Olle.
off now. I turn off now. Yep.
Yep.
Bye, Olle.
Bye bye.